Before we start today's show, I would like to make a big announcement. The Articles of ADOS is joining the WCRS FM family here in Columbus, Ohio. So not only will you be able to listen to the show on your favorite podcast app, but here locally on WCRS 92.7 or 98.3. Same great information and same great program. We hope that you will continue to listen and support the show now that we are moving to Fridays, 10 a.m. That's right. The Articles of ADOS podcast is moving to Fridays at 10 a.m. So join us every Friday for undiscussed news you may have missed.
Today's show is sponsored by Yafa Bay and her Spirit of Tepereth Metaphysical Marketplace, here to provide you and your naturally special gifts with guidance and support through your life's journey, providing you tools such as candles, incense, charms, jewelry, oils, crystals, and much more. Visit them at 1273 West Broad Street in Columbus, Ohio, or online at spiritoftepereth.com. You can find all our sponsors' information in the show notes on our website. Now let's start the show.
The controversial group leading the charge, ADOS, or the American Descendants of Slavery. The controversial group ADOS, or the American Descendants of the controversial group ADOS, the American Descendants of the controversial group ADOS.
Welcome to the Articles of ADOS podcast, a weekly show where we bring you undiscussed news, articles, and information important to the American descendants of slavery, our friends, and our allies. This is episode 19. I'm your host, Lisa and Daud, along with my co-host,
Daud Giazan. On today's show, we will share some articles from the Moguldom Nation, The Final Call, the Cochrane Review, BrassCheck.com, ForbiddenKnowledgeTV.net, and Truth in Media. Later in the show, stay tuned for our main event, where we dive into and interview the book, Panic, What the Coronavirus Tells Us About the State of the World.
Personality.
Peace.
This week in our personality piece, I'm going to pose a question that forces us once again to have personalities.
Okay, what questions do you have for us this week?
How do we not stay a captured voting bloc? How do we convince black people that you are captured? We seem to think we are not. After Joe Biden chose his running mate this week, I noticed the black community was really excited. They were completely enamored with Miss Harris, Kamala Harris, that she, one, was a woman, and two, that she was a person of color, and that also he had made a historic choice. Never mind the protests, never mind defund the police, never mind let's change things, never mind reparations, never mind the black agenda, all symbolic. Our community loved the fact that Kamala was a woman and Kamala was a black woman. That means no matter what is going on in our life, majority of us are captured. We're only going to vote anybody but Trump. So if it's anybody but Trump, you will accept anything, accept anybody, and you are captured. That means no matter what is going on in the world, you will vote Democratic without asking for anything, without requiring anything.
Well, captured is a very confining word, and I can agree on its accuracy. So I tend to look at history to see what can likely happen. We could say that we were captured up until the 1920s, 30s, before the New Deal programs. Staunch Republicans, do or die Republicans. I know people can't imagine that today, but we were. And people had those same discussions then. Are we so captured to the Republican Party just because it's associated with Lincoln and the freedom of our people? Yeah. So what did we get? After being shut out of welfare programs that helped millions of white Americans make it into the middle class, black folks started to get a little bit uppity. And it didn't help that we were losing a number of our people through voting rights attempts, and other times just living, like being accused, we now know, of whistling at white women and causing the death of young teenagers. That bolstered more support and more drive for people making demands on the society. So by the mid 60s, a lot of those demands were adhered to. And so we became more committed to the democratic idea at that time. Sadly, they have changed. We have been slow to, until Obama and Obama's aftermath mainly. And so here we're at a state of flux. We still have a significant number of baby boomers, people in my age group, who are still beholden to those glory days, one could say, while we have some new up-and-comers that are a little bit confused and a little bit disjointed because of how Obama has definitely failed us. And so we've got movements going on. And ours, which I know, not just believe, I know ours is the principal one. We're still a minority within a minority, but we're growing. And we are going to eventually, I believe, do what we were successfully able to do from the 1950s to the 1960s. And I just started the 1950s. We could really say the 1930s or 40s, really. It took 20 years to make that eventual shift into the Democratic Devotion Party. What now do we need to do? Well, we know a third party is going to do it because the two primary parties are corrupted. So if we do not go into a direct third party, right now we're in the stance of leveraging our historical position in the Democratic Party and attempting to force them to yield to a black agenda, if not reparations itself. And depending on whether or not we get either frustrated with that, will determine, or successful in that, will determine whether or not a third party alternative, which has also come in the past for women's right to vote and even the freedom of enslaved Africans to participate in the democratic idea. So are we captured? Time will tell, and our efforts will ring true or not.
Well, I'd have to say I fell out of that captured right after Obama left office, and there ain't no looking back for me. You're going to earn your vote, and that goes for any party in America. So you're either going to earn my vote or earn my no vote. It's up to you either way. So I'm not captured anymore. I'm hoping that more of my fellow ADOS, fellow Black Americans, fellow diaspora can come along, hop on the train of independence, make candidates work for your vote, get your agenda at least addressed by these candidates. So, you have to be willing to not be involved in order to get things handled and taken care of.
And we truly need to be on not just a good saying, but we need to be living no permanent enemies, no permanent friends, a black agenda.
Exactly.
Catch the fire. If you're ADOS, an ally or friend, we encourage you to connect with a local ADOS chapter and help change your local politics. Our ADOS Ohio chapter in Columbus meets every fourth Sunday of the month. For more information on the time and location, visit adoscolumbus.org. You can also get more information on the ADOS movement, our politics, and the agenda. Please visit ados101.com. This week in ADOS history, we give listeners a chance to know the strides ADOS made despite efforts to keep us at bottom caste. From the week of August 14th through the 20th, we have
August 16, 1922, author and investigative reporter Louis E. Lomax is born in Valdosta, Georgia. Little is known today, but in the 1960s, Lomax was one of the most prominent black journalists in America. He was renowned for his coverage of the civil rights movement and his investigative reporting. He died mysteriously in an automobile accident near Santa Rosa, New Mexico on July 30th, 1970. One urban legend is that his car was forced off the road by persons working for the FBI because he was completing a book which would show that the assassination of civil rights icon Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was part of a government plot. This urban legend is often repeated, but there has been little concrete evidence afforded to support it. Lomax's best-known books are Negro Revolt and To Kill a Black Man.
August 19th. 1791, Benjamin Banneker writes a letter to Secretary of State, later President, Thomas Jefferson, denouncing slavery. In his letter, Banneker declared, "I freely and cheerfully acknowledge that I am of the African race," and then proceeds to label America's recently achieved freedom from England a hypocrisy, as long as blacks continue to suffer under groaning captivity and cruel oppression. Banneker was a black activist against slavery, even though he is generally recognized for his mathematical achievements, designing one of the first clocks made in America and laying out the nation's capital after Pierre L'Enfant abandoned the job. Are you busy? Is the news coming so fast you can barely keep up? No worries. The Articles of Ados podcast is here to help. Hit the subscribe button wherever you're listening right now, and we'll make sure you stay up to date on the news and information that affects you and your ADOS life. In today's Rapid News Reports, we have some articles that you may have missed, all in some way affect you and your ADOS life. Up first, we have
We'll never fix systemic racism by being polite. Tagline: contrary to the sanitized version we sometimes hear about the civil rights movement, change was not achieved solely by protest marches and people singing "We Shall Overcome." From the publication Scientific American, author and writer Alden Morris. Polarized America agrees on one thing, that the current round of protests against racist police violence may indeed force real reform. President Trump thinks that protesters want to overthrow the American Revolution, and that the National Guard and regular military. Black Lives Matter activists worry that these protests, like so many over the last few decades, will eventually subside, leaving temporary concessions, symbolic victories, and an unaltered regime of systemic racism, along with unabated police violence. History shows us that Trump has some reason for fear, not of an actual rebellion, but of a revolution that could overturn the racism that still pervades American society. Starting in the 1950s and continuing until the 1970s, civil rights protests overthrew the century-long and deeply embedded Jim Crow system in the South. How they accomplished this can offer important lessons for those intent on making Trump's fears come true. The protests are disrupting police routines, including their routine use of excessive violence against communities of color, and forcing them to restrain their wrongdoing in confronting legitimate protests. The confrontations between police and protesters have produced high-profile police misconduct that has led, as it did in Birmingham, to larger and more disruptive protests, promising to produce the chronic crisis that Martin Luther King prescribed as a necessary prerequisite for meaningful negotiation. I graded this article good, as it shows that we did not just march, we also created change. And up next,
from the publication The Intercept, entitled Trump's CFPB Deploys Predatory Lenders as First Responders to Tagline: the agency deregulated small dollar lending by repealing key consumer protections on payday and auto title loans. Written by Terry Friedland. The Consumer Financial Protection Bureau's rule makes racial capitalism even more punishing by paving the way for predatory lenders to prey on marginalized borrowers. The economic stimulus payments that Congress approved under the CARES Act appeared to help people make it through the early months of the pandemic, and new applications for small dollar loans declined during April and March. Now, with Congress's failure to extend benefits, loan applications are rising steadily, along with eviction fears, job losses, and coronavirus infection and death rates. Black and brown households applied for these loans at a rate 3 times higher than did white households. Trump's executive orders actually operate a lot like payday loans, taking advantage of people's precarious conditions by offering immediate relief while their debts accumulate with no way of repaying them. Mutually reinforcing policy decisions effectively deploy predatory lenders and their 400% interest rates as first responders to the pandemic, not willing to throw out life vests. Trump's government encourages people to drown in debt. I graded this good. Then next, from the publication, The New York Times, entitled Faith in Quick Test Leads to Epidemic That Wasn't, by author Gina Kolata. The big message is that every lab is vulnerable to having false positives. Dr. Petty said, no single test result is absolute, and that is even more important with a test result based on PCR. As for Dr. Herndon, though, she now knows she is off the hook. I thought I might have caused the epidemic, she said. I graded this article good. This article from 2007 shows how the PCR test, the same test used to diagnose COVID-19, produced over 100 false positives at a New Hampshire hospital, which drove hospital administrators there to label what they were experiencing as an epidemic. It turned out that it was just the common cold. According to the CDC's own literature, the tests do not rule out bacterial infection or other viruses. They are detecting all varieties of coronavirus, including the common cold, and counting results as COVID-19. And next,
Fact check. What percentage of white Southerners own slaves? From the publication The Mogul Nation, author and writer Anne Brown. When it comes to reparations, one of the consistent arguments against them is that there were actually not very many white slave owners in the U.S. Recently, reparations activist Duke Professor William Sandy Darity disputed this on Twitter. He posted, "One lie circulating that 1% of white Southerners owned slaves, hashtag FHTE, in 1860. 1% of white Southern families owned 200 or more human beings. But in states of the Confederacy, at least 20% owned at least one, and in Mississippi and South Carolina ran as high as 50%. To better understand the extent of slavery's impact, we need to realize the slave owner was the one person in the family who legally owned slaves. That person was usually the patriarch. There would be a spouse and sons and daughters who directly benefited from the family's slave ownership and who stood to inherit enslaved people. So according to the census of 1860, 30.8% of the free families in the Confederacy owned slaves. That means that every third white person in those states had a direct commitment to slavery. This is a lot of slave owners. The free labor these slaves provided and how the slave owners profited financially from slavery are just some of the reasons why ADOS continues to fight for reparations for Native Black Americans. I graded this article good. I also want to send a shout out to the writer Anne Brown. A lot of articles that grab my attention that I click on and choose, she just happens to be the writer. So thank you for your work and advocacy for ADOS. And up next,
from the publication, the Cochrane Review, entitled New Cochrane Review Assesses How Accurate Antibody Tests Are for Detecting COVID-19. Author, Cochrane Review staff. The review concludes that the data supporting existing antibody tests are so vague that it's impossible to know how accurate the tests are, especially for people with mild or no symptoms or after symptoms have gone. I graded this article good. The Cochrane Review evaluates antibody tests, which pointed out that the data consisting of 11,000 publications and 16,000 samples was inaccurate. One of the reasons is that out of at least 6 possible categories of subjects for test evaluations, only one group was the source of those samples, the seriously ill, which tells the scientists of the review absolutely nothing regarding the efficacy of such tests on anyone. Yet this method and the flawed PCR test are considered the standard for evaluating the presence of COVID-19. And next,
Black Reparations Group calls for Black Lives Matter to refocus. When Black people get justice, everybody else benefits. From the publication The Mogul Nation, author and writer Ashika Harrison, a Black reparations group is calling on the Black Lives Matter movement and others focused on racial justice to narrow their efforts. The request was made by proponents of the American Descendants of Slavery movement, which advocates specifically for reparations for Black Americans whose lineage traces back to slavery in the United States. Over 100 people attended the rally in Eugene, Oregon called "Where Do We Go From Here?" Reclaiming the Movement. Speakers said the protests that have lit up America since the murder of George Floyd should focus solely on obtaining rights, justice, equality, and reparations for Black people with roots in American slavery and not other groups, reported the Register Guard. Affirmative action was made for Black people, but we have seen by and large affirmative action benefits single white mothers more than it does Black people, when the truth is when Black people do get justice, everybody else benefits, said rally organizer Andiel Brown. But the problem is, for the most part, we do not get the benefit from the work we do. We must be specific on what we are fighting for and for whom. Talia Stroud, who also spoke at the rally, agreed with Brown and emphasized the distinctions among ethnic groups. If we are not careful, we lose sight of who this movement is supposed to be for, Stroud said, listing names like George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, and Tamir Rice. Stroud said Black, Indigenous, and people of color are from a variety of people groups, and they have their own histories and often known countries of origin. I encourage each of them to take up their cause and seek their own justice claim, with the responsible parties. We must not allow 400 years and the sum of atrocities to not be credited to the right people. I graded this article good. And up next,
from the publication brasstech.com, entitled Dr. Fauci's First Con. Writer, Brasstech staff. A deadly new virus is discovered. There's no treatment or cure. It's highly contagious. Everyone is a potential victim. The world is at risk from asymptomatic super spreaders. New clusters of cases reported daily. Billions of dollars are authorized for fast-track drug and vaccine research. Simple, effective remedies are rejected while expensive, dangerous ones are pushed. Presumptive diagnosis, exaggerated death statistics, falsified death certificates. COVID 2020? No. AIDS in the 1980s. I graded this analysis good. And next,
title, Trauma, Terror, and Black America's Race-Based Torment. From the publication The Final Call, contributing writer Michael Z. Muhammad. It was a particularly hot August day, temperatures topping out at 95 degrees in Aurora, Colorado. As screams of children pierced the sky. Desperate, they lay handcuffed on their stomachs, hogtied on scorching asphalt like animals. It was to have been a heavenly girls' day out at the nail salon. Pampering and such, Brittany Gilliam planned for her daughter 6 and her sister 12 and 2 nieces aged 14 and 17. The day went from heaven to hell in minutes when police pounced, guns drawn, demanding everyone out of the vehicle on August 2nd, cuffing the 17-year-old and the 12-year-old behind their backs, the 14-year-old lying next to the 6-year-old on their stomachs in the nail salon parking lot. All of this captured on video. Police say it was a mistake. Cops looking for a stolen motorcycle pulled a high-risk stop on a black family in a van. Apparently, officers didn't know how to read letters and numbers for a stolen license plate. According to CNN, the Secret Service is investigating the felony traffic stop and claims some parts of the woman's account are untrue. What isn't untrue is a clear lack of compassion in these and other encounters with police that produce trauma, terror, and mental torment long after the initial encounter, if the person involved actually lives through it. While the significant criticism of police departments across the nation is that they are racist, abusive, deadly, and disconnected from black communities, they mentally burden black people. I graded this article good. Up next,
from the publication ForbiddenKnowledgeTV.net, entitled Dr. Judy Mikovits, Plague of Corruption. Tagline, Dr. Judy Mikovits, top-level molecular virologist and author of Plague of Corruption, Restoring Faith in the Promise of Science. Mikovits worked at the National Institutes of Health under Anthony Fauci for decades, who she says stole her proprietary research not once but twice. Writer, Forbidden Knowledge TV staff. We now know 30 years later that the vaccines have driven essentially every pandemic, and that's why we're calling them plandemics. Just like Zika in 2017, the Ebola outbreak in 2014 clearly was a lab-manipulated virus. Our work in 2011 should have changed the world, and COVID-19 is really a cover-up of those 50 million people worldwide who they've infected now with gamma retroviruses, with contagious cancer-causing viruses, and this is why everything's called COVID-19, no matter the way you die. I graded this story good. And then next from the publication, brasscheck.com, entitled Michael Levitt, Nobel Prize winner in chemistry, was censored and ignored. Tagline, he saw very serious errors in the modeling, reported them, and here's what happened. Writer, brasscheck.com staff. There should have been a committee formed, such as by the Nobel Organization, the Royal Society, the National Academy, in the middle of February. Instead, we let economics and politics dictate the science. Then for me, the worst opposition I got was from very prominent scientists who were so scared. There was total panic, and the fact is that what we were hearing, for example from the WHO, was wrong. We had Facebook censoring even the WHO, which showed contrary views. This has been a disgraceful situation for science. Everything I said in the first 6 weeks has come true. The data had very clear things to say. I tried to share reports by email, and all I got was abuse. For political reasons, we as scientists let our views be corrupted. Nobody said to me, let me check your numbers. They all just said, stop talking like that. I rated this interview good. And next,
6 questions about slavery reparations answered. Tagline: W. Kamau Bell visits New Orleans to explore the topic of reparations on United Shades of America, Sunday, August 16th at 10 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. From the publication CNN.com, authors and writer Brianna Hare and Doug Chris. If you feel like you're hearing more about slavery reparations, it's not your imagination. The widespread protests against police brutality and racial injustice following the death of George Floyd have brought a new urgency to the debate around compensating the descendants of American slaves. This summer, Democratic lawmakers called for a vote on a bill to study reparations, and a handful of cities and states have weighed in with their own proposed plans to examine the issue. But just how would reparations focused specifically on slavery work? Read on as the writers explore 6 questions. 1. Why are reparations in the news? 2. How do you put a cash value on hundreds of years of forced servitude? 3. Where would the money come from? 4. But reparations mean more than cash payout, right? Number 5. What are the arguments against reparations? And lastly, number 6. This isn't the first time reparations have come up, is it? I graded this article excellent. Up next,
from the publication Truth in Media, entitled New Study Shows Hydroxychloroquine Cuts COVID Death Rates in Half. Writer Ben Swan. It is the dirtiest word in all of social media. Hydroxychloroquine. Just uttering that word can get you kicked off of social media. Remember that group of America's frontline doctors? They held a news conference where they touted the effects of hydroxychloroquine. They were banned in unison by YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. What we do know is that in 2005, there was a study done on the effects of chloroquine on another coronavirus, one known as SARS. And that study shows that the effects of chloroquine not only helped patients to recover from SARS, but helped to prevent them from getting it in the first place. On top of that, there is a brand new study out of Michigan that shows that, in fact, hydroxychloroquine has, at least in some cases, cut the death rate for COVID-19. Other media is not going to tell you the truth about this. I graded this story excellent. More detailed facts about these studies you will find by just using the link to the report in our show notes. Remember, the doctors' march on Washington? They were collectively fed up with our for-profit system. Then big medicine and big pharma interest had their goons in the media throw up series after series of doctor malpractice cases. Of course, the public should know that, but it was no accident that the public was being deluged by those reports in order to disparage the doctors' protests then. By omitting those doctors in Texas' scientific view on a cheaper yet effective drug, we are witnessing what big medicine and big pharma are perpetuating against the public now, in your face. Also from the publication Truth in Media, entitled Yale Study to Manipulate Americans into Taking COVID Vaccine. Writer Ben Swan. For those of you who are unsure or those of you who say no, Yale University is working on a study to make sure they know how to properly manipulate you into actually taking the vaccine. The study is being created to figure out different ways to measure or persuade Americans to take the vaccine when it becomes available, and some of what that particular study is looking at will probably infuriate you. So let's talk about this Yale study that has just been leaked. In the study, about 4,000 participants is being done with one purpose: how to convince Americans to take the coronavirus vaccine. Now here's my favorite comparator sample: trust in science. Vaccination is backed by science. If one doesn't get vaccinated, that means that one doesn't understand how infections are spread, or who ignores science. Trust in science, they say, is not based upon trusting the fact that, by the way, not all vaccinations work for all people. And by the way, even the flu vaccine that is taken by millions of people every year, the CDC's own numbers show only 40 to 60% of the people who take the flu vaccine actually have benefit from it. Even if you believe completely in vaccines, let's not even debate about the side effects of vaccines. The real reason for this Yale study is because even with the flu vaccine, less than half of the US population actually takes that vaccine on any given year. That is a number that Big Pharma is afraid of, that Bill Gates is afraid of, that Anthony Fauci, that if half of Americans won't take a flu vaccine, and it's likely that even fewer will be willing to take their coronavirus vaccine. I graded this report excellent. More detailed facts about this leaked Yale study you will find by just using the link to the report in our show notes. In the report, Mr. Swan even says, "What are we, 5 years old?" Sadly, as so many adults have refused to ask questions of the same people who lied us into war, lied about other infectious diseases, too many will be in line getting that shot, just from the manipulations they have already experienced. And that's it for this week's Rapid News. All articles featured will be posted in our Facebook group and in the show notes of our website.
Time now for the main event.
In this week's main event, we will interview the book Panic: What the Coronavirus Tells Us About the State of the World, written by Kidi Awadu. I will ask the questions and Lisa will give the answers. Good day, sir. Welcome to our program. From your hot off the press book, Panic: Coronavirus and the State of the World. Let's begin with your chapter, Contradictions Abound. What do you mean, contradiction?
In the section News Media, Big Headlines but Little Substance, I demonstrate that much of what has stoked the high level of hysterical fear and panic over this threat of a COVID-19 infections epidemic is a failure on the part of the general public to get beyond sensational headline news. People have been reluctant to dig deeper into variable facts on many, if not all, aspects of virology and epidemiology. Deep understanding of matters scientific is not one of the most notable qualities of contemporary Americana. On May 5th, 2020, CBS News featured this headline news story: 3 USDA meat inspectors dead. About 145 diagnosed with COVID-19. This likely sounds shocking from the headline, doesn't it? Trust me, there is no reason to get excited, unless, of course, you are a family member or a friend of the deceased. This minuscule death rate is not of any statistical, epidemiological significance when we consider what the normal background death rates for Americans actually are. While I could never dismiss the threat to people who handle animal carcass materials regularly, these 3 deaths among meat inspectors are not particularly alarming. The average background death rate in America before the onset of the current pandemic was 8.7 deaths annually per 1,000 in the population. There are 6,500 meat inspectors in the U.S., according to the Food Safety and Inspection Services, FSIS. Thus, during any given year, it is expected that an average of 56 of these 6,500 individuals will die on average in the U.S. When we consider what the diseases associated with the numerous reports to be COVID-21 comorbidities now total as many as 21. Thus, it is not at all alarming that 3 of these meat inspectors have died during the first few months of the year. For whatever reason, their deaths were labeled as COVID-19 antibody positive associated. Once again, an alarming headline that has little real substance behind it. Some of us read the headlines and then pontificate. Others among us read the whole story and then contemplate it.
Yes, I can see why that is a very important thing to do on such an important matter impacting Americans, especially ADOS. Please point out another crucial contradiction, sir.
In the section Disproportional Deaths in the U.S., I was nearing completion of the book during the final days of May 2020. To date, the United States is reporting a COVID-19 death toll of 103,000, while the global number of deaths from this pandemic number is reported to be 365,000. At a population total as of May 2020 of 329,693,500 million, what? This nation has less than 5% of the world population, but it is registering nearly 30% of deaths from this infectious pandemic. This disproportional mortality is in direct contradiction with per capita healthcare expenses for the U.S., which are the highest in the world.
Why do you find this to be a significant contradiction?
When compared to others among the top 12 national investments within the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, or OECD community, the U.S. spends almost twice as much per capita on healthcare as the average of the next 11 countries. For all the might of this humongous investment in healthcare services, the fact is that the nation has 28.6% of the worldwide COVID-19 deaths, despite only 4.3% of the global population, and the fewest words necessary to adequately describe this imbalance: this sucks.
So you're indicating that most Americans are being manipulated into believing that such a disproportionate death statistic is a reflection of how bad the coronavirus is. Instead, you are pointing out that the coronavirus is more like an indictment of how horrible America's for-profit healthcare system is, relative to other countries who spend less, yet have suffered significantly far less from our COVID-19 death results. Correct?
I could dedicate an entire volume to the immense problems with the U.S. healthcare system. Let me try to confine my criticism to the fewest possible points. The U.S. healthcare system is dominated in both education and practice by the American Medical Association, a structure created by financing from the Rockefeller Trust, is overly profit motivated, believes that the best solution to the resolution of disease is to suppress symptoms using medication, too often ignores the best database scientific evidence in favor of those outcomes which suit the self-interest of profiteering corporations, and is in an illicit and undermining relationship with an oligarchical media hierarchy that has become dependent on medical advertisement income.
So you are pointing out that our corrupt for-profit system is the primary factor in America's disparate levels of COVID-19 related deaths, thus a direct contradiction to the notion that we have the finest healthcare system in the world.
But haven't we heard some crazy news reports about possible outbreaks of infectious diseases over recent decades that led to unfounded fear and panic among the public?
Yes, I can recall a few. Yet sadly, so many of the American population has a short memory on such important lies told to the American people about such matters.
Besides the expected fearful projection about the annual flu season that hype up a need to get vaccinated each time around, we have seen many such media hype fears over the decades. H1N1 swine flu, when the U.S. became alarmed over a 1976 outbreak, the government rushed into place an emergency vaccination program that managed to inject 45 million people before it was abruptly halted, after a significant number of people became paralyzed from the rare Guillain-Barré syndrome immediately after the injection.
What are some other controversies related to American for-profit institutions and the coronavirus?
The coronavirus conundrum. I have come to the point of disbelieving any news story with any mention of the virus. There are so many shaky variables in this whole story. How long has it been around? Where are the gold standard papers published that validate this as a distinct phenomenon? If more than 19 coronaviruses are identified, and they have been around for more than 65 years, then how can we accurately determine that any or all of us do or do not have IgG antibodies to such elements?
IgG antibodies, which could explain why most who get the coronavirus are asymptomatic or experience mild to moderate symptoms. Also, this is perhaps why the WHO itself has admitted that it is extremely rare for coronavirus asymptomatic individuals to transmit the disease, after months initially claiming that asymptomatic people were causing the spread of the disease.
Then there is the fundamental challenge as to whether this so-called virus can be verified as an infectious pathogen, a harmless passenger agent, or merely an exosome, which is a commonly occurring extracellular vesicle that is common to every eukaryotic cell species.
Are there additional contradictions or conflicts of interest with regards to the medical industry and their handling of the COVID-19 pandemic you find problematic?
These days, Johns Hopkins Medical Research Institute is the leading U.S. university engaged in monitoring the epidemiology of COVID-19 as it impacts the nation. Can they be trusted to tell the whole truth regarding the research in which they are engaged? I dare say, not wholly.
Why is that?
Johns Hopkins has been involved in some notoriously sinister events in the past, including one, appropriating the uterine cancer cells from Henrietta Lacks in the early 1950s and incorporating them into a commercialized cell line from which they profited. Number 2, participating in a notorious Tuskegee syphilis study where they gathered blood plasma from the bodies of untreated blacks and used that product in a patented test for syphilis. And 3, participating along with the Rockefeller Foundation and U.S. health agencies in a Central American syphilis study where unwittingly Guatemalans, including children, were intentionally infected with syphilis.
Do you have other concerns and final thoughts?
Again, just to name a few, and on a serious comparison that most people are missing. As of May 2020, the already shockingly list of COVID-20 comorbidities keeps on expanding. We have been here before at this, now beginning to rival the list of 29 diseases and disorders said to be associated with HIV infection, according to the CDC's 1993 redefinition.
Yes, other researchers in the field are noticing the similarities to what we are being told about the ever-expanding COVID-19 disease profiles and how they are very similar to the disease progression of HIV/AIDS. It's as though authorities like Dr. Fauci, who was heavily involved in presenting HIV/AIDS to the American public in the 1980s, are dishing all this out like some sort of play-by-play manual. Yet such views are being disappeared from the discussion on this serious matter.
These coronavirus claims are getting crazier every week. Just this week, there was added another rare disease associated with a COVID-19 antibody determination. The mystery-shrouded pediatric multi-system inflammatory syndrome, or PMSIS. This is a catch-all designation that includes common symptoms such as persistent fever, stomach pains with vomiting, extreme inflammation, organ malfunction, and other symptoms. From my interpretation, this PMSIS sounds like a pediatric acquired immune deficiency, what one might call children's AIDS. In more recent days, speculation has now risen that, like HIV, the virus assumed to be at the center of the AIDS pandemic, COVID-19, might be suspected of sexual transmission, as more than one laboratory claims to have found the virus in seminal fluid. Crazy, I say. But with this novel coronavirus, crazy has become the new norm.
Well, that completes this interview. Listeners, you can access the book by purchasing it by way of the link on our website and in this week's show notes. Coming up, we have the commentary on this book segment. Did we like it? Did we hate it? Stay tuned.
We want to take the time to give our friends and listeners a shout out. Thank you for clicking that subscribe button and for liking and sharing the podcast. You can also continue supporting the show by joining our Patreon, where you can receive exclusive content and promotional items for as little as $3 a month. Sponsoring the show will ensure that we can continue to bring you the news and information important to your ADOS life. So head on over and join us at patreon.com/articlesofados. All right, so what do you think of the segment of this book?
Well, this brother Kidi Awadu is a fantastic researcher, has experience in this area, and has written several books on this topic. And so he had to jump all over the plandemic, phenomenal hysteria that has come out of this. From his perspective, it's all so much hype. So he just really wanted to get this book out to redefine, and this is a portion of the book we didn't get to, redefine how a pandemic should not be used as an excuse for people panicking. He's even turned the panic word into an acronym that leads to something positive. Please get the book to find out what that is. It's very helpful. At the other time, what we hit there towards the end, I really sensed in you a sort of recoil that here's another problem that coronavirus is presenting for people that are caring for children, babies, that there may be an AIDS for babies that is going to come out of this. I saw you recoil. It's like, this is another thing you got to worry about. And it's really sad that they're piling on diseases on top of diseases as a result of this, very similar to what they did with AIDS. That drives people concerned to do something, even though it's not based on science, even though that there is a history, particularly of Dr. Fauci, falsifying things in order to get things out there. And we've already reported from Ben Swan, thank God for Ben Swan, that he and others in authority are going to be benefiting financially from what's being produced in terms of vaccines. So there's definitely an interest in both getting demand up at any cost, and I submit a lot of it is hype, at the same time pressuring people, as we also just reported from Yale, that they're trying to manipulate people into further doing it. And then when you bolster the potential disease outcomes from the coronavirus, increasing the number of associated ailments to something that you have to feel like you've got to do something about, that's further going to increase the likelihood that people are going to be in demand. Even if they have doubts, they're going to want to feel certain that they're taking care of their babies. That is cruel.
Yeah, you're right. When reading the part where about the children's AIDS, it's just like, why are you? Because, I already believe that, we would create the viruses. But why create a virus that is going to target the children? We already targeting, somehow, we got the HPV and we're giving the kids another dose of vaccine. And that came out of nowhere. And it's for a sexually transmitted disease. And you're giving it to children. Okay. That's another one. So now here we have another that's sexually oriented HIV, right? It's kids. So this is another sex type vaccine that the children are going to need.
Sex moves and motivates people.
Yeah. And I understand our children, our teens will participate in sexual activity. But it's like, not only do they want the adults, they want everybody. They want the children, they want the grandparents with the shingles vaccines, they want the elderly, they want the babies, they want the toddlers, they want the young adults, they want the college students with their meningitis vaccine. They want every person on the planet to need a vaccine. And I didn't understand that part with the kids. So it took me aback that now we're going to create a children's AIDS. Wow.
Well, this is why Brother Keaty had to write the book. But I really want to hit on two things you just mentioned and a little bit more of what I said before about the children. This is still in the theoretical stage where they are associating potential ailments that impact children that coronavirus may play a role in. I'm just saying that there's not enough definitive evidence to support that, but they don't care. They're doing the word associations with things that scare people because it has an impact. And when we got to that part of the book where they mentioned an HIV type of things for children's AIDS, it did it. I felt it. I felt it really scare you. And that's the effect they want to have. And that's why I put all these reports together. And I'm sorry for, boat loading on all that stuff. But we have a data specialist who won the Nobel Prize in chemistry saying they're modeling. That means the things they put in to make projections to determine outcomes regarding coronavirus, there's something wrong. He's telling them there's something wrong. And all he's getting back from people is, don't say or talk about all this stuff. They're not saying to him, which they should be if they're professionals, they should be saying, well, let me run the numbers and see how I can coordinate with what you're coming to. They're not saying that. They're just saying, I don't want to know. This is what happens to whites in these areas. They get into white think and they deliver what white political and white elite leaders demand. That's why science has been so critically undermined in this instance and in other instances. And my second point was that you mentioned something that really struck a nerve. You thought it struck a nerve with you what happened to the child you're taking care of. Well, I was there when the HPV vaccine was coming out, and I said to my then wife, we are not going to do this because I remembered the other lies and the other manipulations that were done. We're going to wait and see what happens. Well, shortly after our divorce, I learned that that's exactly what she had our daughters do. 5 years later, we find all these negative effects because of all these injections these children got to protect them from getting cancer later in life, to get this thing. That's why it was all done and pushed on people, to find that the young people that had gotten those shots are disproportionately having problems as a result of that shot. And it's being underreported. And I said to my daughter, I said, that's why I didn't want you to have that shot. And she says, I understand that. But she was a child doing what her mother said because the mother was so scared. And that was one of the reasons why we parted ways, because I cannot continue to buy by these lies and knowing that it affects our children. Okay, I'm off that soapbox. But that is, I understand what moves you. But you have to then go with, well, what do the other scientists say? Are there peer-reviewed, as Brother Keaty said, are there gold standard reviews of what's being done? And what we did when we did this show, I included a Nobel-winning chemistry person who ran the data and said their models are messed up. Now, he should be listened to. He's not listened to. White elites and whites in these professions are going in lockstep with where the money's going, and they're submitting themselves like they're going after the popular kids in high school, following in lockstep. And that is what we should realize is going on here. And sadly, it's like we're being swept up by the fear that's being induced, that this Nobel laureate is even saying is the panic is affecting professionals in the scientific field. They're just following along with what they're being told by their white elite masters. And that is not science. It undermines science.
Yeah, I agree. And then it's something that he said that I really liked. He said, some of us read the headlines and then pontificate. Others among us read the whole story and then contemplate it. That's something that we propose to hope to change with this podcast and with this new show, is for people to give them a little reason to go in a little deeper with a lot of these news stories, to discuss some things that aren't really being discussed. And he's right. You know, a lot of us just read the headlines and that's it. And you think, could the headline be right? Could the headline be wrong?
Could it be manufacturing consent? So you don't read the rest
so
of it?
Is it clickbait? You never know what it is. Don't stop there with the headline. Go in a little deeper and try to find out the story behind the story if you have time to. I know we're all short of attention to a lot of the news that's out there because it's so much, but give it a chance to give yourself a chance to learn a little bit more and not be so strung by your nose, led by your nose around a lot of this news that's going on.
Especially in matters like this that are so important.
All right, that's it for today's commentary. Listeners, you can always find all the information you need on today's main event in our show notes on our website, articlesofados.com.
Today in Serious Questions with Daud, that's me, I'll take a question asked and give commentary on any topic, whether social, economic, cultural, or political. Serious questions get serious answers. Send your questions to Daud at articlesofados.com. Our question today comes from Kiera Watts of ADOS, Kansas City, who asked a serious question on Twitter, and I quote, I once said immigrants seeking asylum from gang violence get benefits of protection policies in the United States, while Black Americans seeking refuge from neighborhood violence get nothing like that. Seriously, why aren't there similar programs that help ADOS who seek better lives? My response: in the mid to late 1990s, I worked as a gang intervention therapist privately and for an organization. I could tell you, Black families could have used such relief instead of the neglect, cruelty, and barbarity they faced from institutions and their neighbors. Juxtapose this with how opioid addicts are treated today. Should I have said white opioid addicts? To make it more clear as to why these disparities exist, specific to immigrants, if this was not true in 1965 when better non-white immigrant legislation was passed due to our leadership's efforts, It was definitely true by the 1980s that non-white immigrants would be used to effectively supplant black ADOS. Allow me to give two examples as to why this is so. One, the term Hispanics, which we've already covered on Articles of ADOS. Why was it needed? Because whites largely resented and disregarded Mexicans who had earlier been legally accepted as white. The Nixon administration, by creating the Hispanic terminology, allowed for even more groups to be included as acceptable non-white immigrants as a centralizing focus. With a slight reference to Spain, a European country, in the name, this would act as a bridge to whiteness, a group Nixon believed could be used to reduce the impact of the black electorate. Most Hispanics I've talked to over the years don't like the designation, for it omits their Guatemalan, Chicano origins, etc. Yet largely 70% of Hispanics identify on census forms as white. You've witnessed the Democratic leadership in recent years intensify their focus to immigration concerns, right? You've witnessed Trump signing into law a measure specifically for their business interests recently. Hispanics surpassed blacks in population about 10 to 12 years prior to initial projections. This is no accident. 2. Yvette Carnell and Antonio Moore have expeditiously pointed out how state and local governments have virtually unraveled the red carpet to immigrants. Programs just like you've mentioned are just part and parcel of this shift in traditionally non-white immigrant focused. Mostly performed for 5 primary reasons. A. The racial demographic shifts that are on course to making the white collective a minority by the middle of this century. B. Due to our lineage history, blacks often represent the most liberal stances in America's domestic and foreign policies. Therefore, both Democrats and Republicans cooperate to suppress our votes.
Did we answer her question?
Yeah, her question was, why are they getting all these benefits? I gave the historical background and I gave the current political reasoning and what it projects for us in the future.
So I think her question was like with immigrants that move here because they experiencing gang violence, why don't we receive those same type of benefits?
I mean, the brief one on that is because they want us to experience gang violence. Because they want it. What are they doing in Chicago? They're projecting an image of Chicago that's not accurate by over exaggerating the carnage that is taking place there. The carnage is real, but it's being projected as a major concern for the whole nation. Why? Because they're not the number one city in America that's having violent behaviors like that. It's not. So why isn't the American society focused on the number one? Why aren't we hearing about the number one all day, every day? In the state of Illinois, Chicago's not even number one. Richmond in Illinois is number one in violence, gun violence. Why aren't we hearing about Richmond? The reason is what I said last episode, is that Chicago has choice properties black and brown bodies are still on. And they've got to color it negative and bad and violent to justify all types of controls, all types of even military activity to control those populations. And they're going to control them so well, they're not going to be alive there much longer. It's exactly what happened. This is what I didn't say last episode. It's exactly what happened in Katrina. For years, white elites complained about the blacks. Even blacks complained about the poor blacks in Louisiana and in New Orleans, specifically because they had as high as 80% unemployment. 80% unemployment from the youth to the young male adults. 80% unemployment. But the police situation there was so horrible because they were all too often in on crime. So it was hard to complain about the violence there when you had to also answer for the fact that police were involved in that crime. So they didn't get a lot of that type of news. What happened? I have it on my timeline, and I was going to use this for my next one. On my timeline, you'll find a report written by this white woman out of New Orleans that explains how and why the levees broke. They were planned to fail. Now, how does that benefit anybody? Well, what happened as a result? Thousands upon thousands of black poor residents who lived there for generations are now scattered across the nation. There were years and requests, even by Jesse Jackson, came out of retirement to say, what about repatriating our own people back to their homes? It just got scant mention in the news press, but no serious attempts to returning black people to those black areas infused. What's happened? Lower land prices, Wealthier whites came in droves and bought up cheap property and now has squatted themselves in areas where blacks commonly live. And since they have built the levees like they should have to protect those future white investments, I submit the same thing will eventually happen in Chicago. It just won't be a hurricane that does it. It'll be their violence-prone nature that needs to be controlled and contained, and ultimately the people displaced.
There you have it, family. Another week, another show. Thanks for joining us on the Articles of ADOS podcast. Make sure to visit our website, articlesofados.com, where you can join our mailing list, see the show notes for today's episode, and to leave us a voice message to be featured on the show.
If you have any questions, comments, or feedback, send us an email to listeners@articlesofados.com.
Until next time, family, stay safe, stay strong. Peace.